Welcome everybody for the next session of Thriving Through the Decade of Disruption. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. I know a number of you have reached out to me and said that you're also looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to it because I'm going to be talking with Shae Quabba, who I've met a few times now, and she's actually done a session in our MBA course with some of our students, and you're going to really enjoy listening to what Shae is going to talk about, because Shae is in this innovation and in this corporate world, but she comes at it from a very different angle, from a design, thinking, anthropology, ethnography, and some of those terms may not be very familiar to you. You may not understand how they fit in business, but what I really love about the work that Shae does is, and what I've actually learned myself from being in some of Shae's workshops, is a different way of understanding your customer, or understanding the people who you're trying to help. Whether it's a business, or whether it's a not-for-profit, or even if it's just in your day-to-day life, the key is really around, if you're trying to do something, making sure you understand what you're trying to do, making sure, as we've said a lot of time in these series, that you're solving the right problem. And so what you're going to hear from Shae is really about her approach, and the tools, embedded around ethnography and even anthropology, to be able to understand our customers. And in an organization like Suncorp, it's a very large corporate, it's got banking, it's got insurance, it's got a whole range of different services. And in some senses, this series is about how organizations coping with this disruption that's happening. And we know that small companies, medium companies, and very large companies are being disrupted. And we're all trying to work out how to respond to that. So Shae, maybe if we just open up, can you talk to us a little bit about ethnography, anthropology, and why on earth would an organization like Suncorp have someone who actually has those skills, and how do you use those skills to help an organization like Suncorp?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Thanks for having me along today, and hello everyone. Even though I can't see you in this virtual world, it's lovely to have you all here as part of the conversation. Ethnography and anthropology, well, the reason why they're really important is because they're all about people. And if you think about anything that we do in our daily lives, it's about people, really. It's about how people engage with products and services. And when you're trying to innovate or create a new product or a new service, people are a core part of that, whether it is in a business-to-business environment or a business-to-consumer environment as well. So ethnography, if you haven't ever heard of that before, is essentially just a research methodology. It's a way of going about understanding people, and the focus, it's used by anthropologists and sociologists quite a lot, because you immerse yourself in someone else's world, essentially. You do that by observing people, understanding the way that they live, understanding lots of different aspects or domains of their life and how they do things. And that's very different to some other research methods, which I guess, surveys are usually one that is used, or things like voice of the customer, where you're just trying to understand what people say. Ethnography is really trying to get to the heart of, what do people actually do? What do they value? What do they know? It's more of the things that sit below the surface. And that's actually really fascinating, I think. And it's kind of why I do the job that I do.
Yeah. That's cool. And in a lot of the stuff that I talk about in entrepreneurship and around commercialization of new technologies, you're trying to discover the problem. You might have a solution and you're trying to discover the problem. And we talk a lot about around that customer discovery. So who is my customer and what is the problem? And you talked about surveys, which is, easy, SurveyMonkey, and there's lots of tools to do that at scale. But we also realize that, customers, they lie all the time. They say what they either they think they should say, or what they think you want them to say. There's a whole lot of reasons. And so what I love about ethnography is, and this field of observation is that it gets you in behind what the pretense might be into what is real. And so maybe can you talk to us a little bit about, just to give us some examples of how you might use that for an organization like Suncorp in banking? I mean, how is that useful, and how do you use that to help Suncorp?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the immersing yourself in someone else's world is really important for doing exactly what you said, Cameron. It's try to check the claimed behavior. What do people kind of say versus what do we actually do in our lives? But it's also to check, it's not that necessarily people lie. I don't think there's an intention to lie. I think it's more that we often just live our lives and we do things by habit, by ritual, which is what I talk about a lot. And we don't realize that we're doing it. We're on automatic pilot. And it's only until you go and study and sit and shadow people that you really understand that. Now, from a Suncorp perspective, an example of how I've used that before is literally getting out on the road with one of my colleagues and driving to different homes across Australia. And we were just having conversations with people about their experience with water leaks. That's it. Now that seems really, really simple, but actually while we're in someone's home, we get to understand who they are, how they live, and what they might think about new technologies or opportunities. So when you were referring to before about, what's the problem to solve, I think this is the value really of ethnography, that you can go and understand problems that you didn't think existed, or you can find where tension points are, and that gives you a point of exploration. And that for me is that point of innovation as well, where there's a tension point and you kind of go, oh, how do we unpack that? What do we do with this? So I think that the project that I worked on essentially was about, well, we've had this great idea for a new service that we wanted to offer. Let's go out and speak to people. Traveled around the country, and we figured out pretty quickly that this idea was probably going to sink because we couldn't get enough people to buy the service at the price we wanted, because their habits and rituals at home weren't as what we thought, what we hypothesized. So it was only after we got into their homes and had a chat to them and saw how they lived and walked around their houses with them, understood their family connections, that we were able to really figure that out. And that's very different to if we had sent them a survey and said, hey, would you like this service? To which they probably might have responded, yeah, I think I might like that service. And we could have actually made a really costly decision.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I had an interview with the guy Michael Fox, who started this company called Shoes of Prey, which was a company that was set up to enable primarily women to design their own shoes, from the ground up. Everything from the heels, the material, the ankle straps, and all that stuff that women have in their shoes. And they launched a minimal product, and people loved it. These closet shoe designers were just all over it, and they were recommending it to their friends. Had net promoter scores really high, and I thought, we're onto something really big here. And so they raised $30-40 million, created this large company, and it was going really well. But they sort of, I think what they realized is they saturated that early adopter innovator market, that female who really was desperate to have something unique and something different. Mm-hmm. And they started doing some understanding of why aren't we growing? Why have we hit the ceiling? And they realized that the vast majority of women who are buying shoes have got no idea how to design a shoe and didn't have the confidence. They actually had a lot of people visiting their website and maybe even playing around with it, but they just didn't hit the button that said, order this shoe for $300 or $400. And ultimately, when they talked to them, they said, well, I just don't feel confident that would look good. I'd rather just go to Nordstrom's or David Jones and choose something that I know looks good. And what was great about what Michael said, he's been very generous in his analysis of that, is that they realized that to change, that for them to be successful in that early majority, that mass market, they had to change consumer behavior. And they didn't have enough time or enough money to do that. And so I think, that again, that's why I think ethnography is so important, is because changing customer behavior or changing human behavior is really hard. And I know you've talked about that in terms of, online banking with, say, an older demographic. It sounds, they might download the app, but then they just don't use it. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences in that, trying to change human behavior, and actually sometimes how do you actually do that if you have to do that? Or at one point do you realize, well, actually this is just not going to work?
Yeah, I've got some great examples, including my father, who downloads apps and then doesn't know how to use them and then rings me up for, tech support, and we spend a couple of hours on the phone. Probably like a lot of children of parents. Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things that are going on here. One of the questions that I think we have to ask ourselves is, why do we want to change behavior in the first place? And being really clear about that why. Because you need to have a really deep understanding of what you're trying to do. And then in going to study human behavior or studying rituals, what you can do is start to understand, well, how does what we want to achieve work in with someone's life now? because it's actually very hard to change someone's behavior holistically and flip it overnight. Like that's when we're not built that way as human beings. Our brains aren't built that way. So you need to find ways to kind of splice together routines and habits and rituals. And Uber is a fantastic example of this. And it's one of the ones that I use all the time. Everyone talks about Uber as being disruptive. But essentially, there was already a practice for getting into a stranger's car. It was just called a taxi. It's just that they changed some of the ways in which you consume that service and you go about your life. They removed a lot of friction, which made it a fantastic service. And then from there, they're able to extend what that service looks like into food service delivery, because you've developed a new ritual about using an Uber and an app to call an Uber, and then suddenly you can do that to call food as well, and these other services. So what they've been doing is progressively splicing and changing and substituting rituals to essentially alter behavior over time. And I guess the tricky thing you've got to try and figure out, though, is how long does it take you to do this, and who do you target first to help you with that? And the shoes of prey actually is a fantastic example, because I remember that email coming around the office when that idea first came up. And at the time, I worked in an arts organisation with a lot of creative people. So exactly the target market who would really want to design your own shoes.
Yep.
We weren't representative of a broader population. And so, you know, from there though, how do you look at, well, maybe there are, rather than redesigning an entire whole shoe, how do you look at different elements of what shoes might mean to women? Or, you know, sometimes I look at shoes and I see a brand, but they don't make it in the color that I like. So just even being able to swap color more easily, and you know, so there are things like that that you can look at to start to understand markets a little more effectively, so that you can flip rituals. But it does take some time, and you have to be really clear about why you're doing this. You also have to be really clear about ethically why you're doing this as well. Because I think this is one of the challenges. I had not worked in financial services before I started working at Suncorp. And when I first started the organisation, there were lots of conversations about, well, how do you help support people to manage their finances, just day to day? What does that look like? That's a really good question to ask. But you have to be careful that in coming up with solutions to that, you're not being paternalistic based on how you value money and how, you know, your world and your knowledge of money and how finances should be managed. There are lots of different versions of that. And as soon as you get people into a room, or you let them follow them around and see how they actually manage their money, you start to realize there are lots of different ways to manage money. So then designing for that means something else entirely. And you have to be very clear. Each brand, each, you know, financial institution in Australia has lots of different segments that they appeal to based on who they are, you know, what sort of services and products they offer. So you have to be really clear about all of those factors to understand who your target segments are that you may want to start with first in translating and behavior and substituting rituals, essentially.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think that idea of understanding the rituals, because I mean, we are habitual people, you know, we are ritualistic people, and you talk about that really well. And I think what I learned from Michael's sort of journey is you've got to be very careful, you know, how you play around with that. And those most successful startups and new innovations are something that taps into something. It might be, like you say, an extension of an existing ritual that just makes it easier, lets you do that ritual faster or cheaper or better, rather than transforming it. And this is a whole new way of doing things. And I think that's actually a really important insight when you're trying to change behavior or trying to do something that requires some sort of modification. Because if anyone who wants to take something new, they've got to stop doing something old. So, you know, the advantage of changing has to exceed the disadvantage of not changing. So yeah. I think understanding that is really critical to being able to say, okay, well, I'm going to tweak this a bit. I'm going to make it a little bit better, rather than going in and saying, we're going to transform your world and you're never going to do this the same again. No one's ever going to go into a bank branch again. Now, they said that a long time ago. We've still got bank branches, maybe not as many, but we've still got them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when I go into our store locally here in Brisbane, and I look at who's coming in and why and the service that they get, there's lots of different stories there about why people are in a store. And that doesn't mean that they also can't be a consumer of a digital service or a digital app. In fact, people are looking for ways to seamlessly integrate lots of different service channels in their lives. So I think that, however, I would say that lots of people have moved on from the whole idea of split channels and really trying to understand how people move about the world and how do you provide products and services that meet them where they are. And that would be one of the shifts that I've seen in companies, in decision makers and in conversation and in strategies that where everyone has kind of moved on. The other thing that you raised, Cameron, was just about perhaps trying to do too much. I think sometimes there are really simple things that we just need to look at, simple tension points to look at, rather than coming out with it's not innovation unless it's entirely transformative and entirely a breakthrough. I mean, I kind of look at really transformative innovations, and my phone is one of the ones I always look at the most, is the glass that covers most of our smartphones, in fact all of them, was invented back in the 30s, and they didn't really know what to do with it, and they tried different commercialization options and it never really worked. But the fact that that glass is so tough is revolutionary, but finding an application for it took decades eventually. But now it's a seamless part of life. And the idea that you wouldn't have a glass wrapped something or other technical device is just kind of like, oh, well, of course you would, you know.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think sometimes it is timing, isn't it? It's around waiting long enough. But it comes down to that point, and this is what I want to get to here is that insight, that epiphany, that aha moment. You think, heck, I didn't realize that this is a very valuable insight. And in some senses, innovation is about trying to identify that really valuable insight into human behavior, really. I now have an insight about that problem that I didn't know and maybe no one else knows, or I have an insight into how we can solve that problem or help them in a way. Can you talk to us about any examples in some of your work where you've actually come across that, where you've actually discovered something you thought, aha, that's it. That's either going to kill this thing or it's actually going to make this thing.
Yeah, there's been a few projects like that, usually on the kill side, actually. And I guess that's also the way in which I work. And, you know, lots of aspects of the social sciences or anyone who has any work with science knows that you usually start with some sort of hypothesis. So once we've gone out and we've done a little bit of research and we're trying to pull together what the topics are, then you can develop hypotheses and kind of say, well, let's actually go and test that and see how that works. And quite often our hypotheses are not true, you know, that they are not proven. And that's fascinating because we start out from a space usually of saying, we really think this is going to work. We've done all this research. We factored all these elements in. But then people just turn around and go, no, I'm not using that. I'm just not using that. So I think then that prompts the question, why? And really just trying to understand and get into deeper insight around, well, why didn't they do that? And also, why did we think that that was a really strong hypothesis? I mean, we were just having this conversation very recently this week because we're in a project at the moment and there's a hypothesis that's come back. We've done research on it and people have kind of said, no, we don't really want to do that. Even though we had evidence to show that perhaps they were interested in this kind of interaction point with us. And so now we're questioning, well, okay, is it that they are claiming a certain behavior, or is it that this is just a complete killer for this project because we had built this entire project around this concept and now customers are kind of coming back and the research is coming back saying that's actually not true. But I think that this is also the value of ethnography in this type of work and getting into this insight because you essentially, by spending a relatively small amount of money, myself and my team go away and we figure out, well, is this a thing to help, you know, people make a decision? that is more effective and has a greater chance of success. Now, we can't guarantee success because there's lots of factors when you deploy things, but we can actually come out and say with a pretty good level of confidence, no, we think this will work for people, and here's why, because we've done all of this research and understanding to pick through those insights and get down to those deeper levels of insights. So some of my greatest success stories at work are failures from a project point of view, because essentially I've said, don't invest in that. You're going to waste your money. We're not going to make any money from that. And I work for a company that, you know, is for profit. So we look to make money. So if it's not going to make money for us, then actually we need to reconsider what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's great. So just unpack a little bit for us the actual the nuts and bolts, the technical, because we talk a lot about in lean startup, you know, around building an MVP, a minimal viable product, as some way to test whether consumers will act. So you obviously go in and you observe, you know, you've got some really good spreadsheets and you know, you do time, you know, watching, and you sit in the corner and just sticky beak at people, double-sided glass or whatever it is. But at some point you've got to get that, so you get an understanding, but then you've got to work out, I guess the next stage is, would they use it? And without actually building the whole thing. You don't want to build a factory and build stuff, widgets, and then find out they don't want to use it. So how do you do that with a service and actually get it to the point where, okay, you understand, but you've still got to go to that next stage of saying, would they use it? How do you do that without actually fully developing and launching it?
Yeah, this is where being a child really, really helps. I think one of the best ways to do this is to play games, so to speak. So I'll give you a really good example of this. A couple of years ago, I was trying to test something out as a potential new product. And we really needed to see how people would make a decision in situ. Now, we couldn't quite mimic the in situ, but we could get a whole group of people together and see and prompt and create a circumstance where they had to make a decision. And they had to make trade-off decisions, because those trade-off decisions would tell us whether or not they were going to actually buy the product ultimately. So I created a game, and it was a cross between kind of Go Fish and Monopoly. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. And gameplay is really good for prompting some of these lived experiences. So we set up this game, we tested it with 50 customers in 24 hours. We then looked at the results that came in. And what was great is while I'm sitting there playing the game with this group of people, we broke them down into groups of 4, you could actually see people's minds changing as they were playing this game, because they could see when someone else made a decision and they had a little moment of envy where they kind of went, oh, you get this. Well, hang on. I want to swap. Hang on, I want to trade. So I'll trade this and I'll trade that. And that was insightful. And they were actually this was all recorded, and they were the snippets that I shared with the rest of the team, because they were the moments, they were the aha moments of saying that there is what is going to make people buy. So then how do we take that insight and turn it into something tangible, turn it into the actual service or the interaction experience that someone is going to have? And that again that's the next step of testing that. But for me, that's really the way in which you test out, would people want to buy? I tend to use play quite a bit. A lot of my practice is participatory. So, you know, quite often design is seen as you design for people, but actually you get a much better and affecting result if you design with people. So participatory innovation really tries to use some of these techniques like gameplay or, you know, participatory actions, or what we call tangible interviewing or tangible tools. That's why behind me, you can probably see I've got a box of Lego up there. That's always handy where you try to get people to build things with you, because it just changes the way people actually think about things. Play is really, really important. And when you think about being a child, play is where you get to live another life, but it's safe. You're essentially trying to create the same thing in a meeting room somewhere for customers so that they feel safe in making some decisions. Now, you could argue that that's not going to cut the mustard when it comes to a pure scientific test, but it gives us enough to be able to go and say, that's a piece of insight we can now work off to create a new product or to create a new service.
Yeah. Look, that's really interesting. Can you talk to us a little bit about, and I know we've talked a little bit about how an organisation like Suncorp is going to engage with a new group of customers. So, you know, millennials, Gen Zs. I know you and I have talked about this, about different ways, because Zin, one of the participants, has asked this question on Q&A around how do you get into a new market, a new customer, when they're not a customer now, but Suncorp knows that they have to be a customer. They are going to be all of your customers before too long. How do you actually then, when you've got a group of people who really are very much on the edge of being customers, how do you then work out your understanding of what you need to do as a company to be able to be appealing or to appeal to these customers? How have you gone about helping Suncorp be able to understand that?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of different ways of tackling this. And I think this is the beautiful marrying of thick data that tends to come from the work of social science and the massive data sets that we have, not just internally in a company, but externally that you can access and leverage. So one of the first steps, I think, is actually just, if you've got a rough idea of who you want to target, then you've already almost there. If you've got no idea who you want to target, then you actually have to go out and immerse yourself in people's worlds, and lots of people that are different to your current customer base. So you really need to know your customer base very well. I'm actually often surprised how little some companies really know their customers, really know how they live. I think there is lots of reported experiences that companies will know about, but perhaps not really understanding who these people are, how they live every day, what do they do. So if you're able to go and investigate those worlds, you start to get and develop little theories out of that. From that, you're able to then figure out, well, how many of those people live somewhere? Can I identify behavioral patterns? Can I identify certain patterns in what I'm finding about how these people live that I can then extrapolate across a broader segment, across a broader data set, and those data sets can come from lots of different places. So there's lots of marketing data sets that you can use on Australians. There's, there's lots of data about people out there in the world. We hand that over really, really willingly. You just have to go and find it, but you have to marry the two together. And I think this is the beauty of where machine learning is coming in as well. How do you identify behavioral patterns by perhaps doing ethnography, pull that together as observational points that you can then train data on. And that enables you to predict where you may have your new customer corridor, for example, or customer group. So that would be one aspect. I would say another aspect is where you, sometimes it's like basic things. You want to, you talked earlier about digital uptake. So I think this is where COVID has really changed things because obviously overnight, none of us could actually really go outside our front doors. So our rituals were disrupted massively. We had to start engaging more digitally, including things like this. So rather than sitting down at UQ, having a conversation with you in situ at campus, here we are on a webinar. It's the same thing, I guess, for the products that we have. The company has spent a whole heap of time and effort and energy from all of our different teams as soon as COVID hit to make sure that our customers were able to access information to help them. Some of those customers had never used digital platforms before. They were learning for the first time. So just helping them step through that process as well. And I would say that disruption gives a great opportunity to figure out, well, where you might have thought someone was not a customer before, actually they could be, because rituals have been disrupted, whereas they're now an opportunity for you. Yeah.
What I love about one thing you've just said is this idea that so many companies just don't really understand their customer. I think that's, for me, that's ironic, isn't it? Because they've got these enormous marketing departments whose entire job is to communicate with, well, I guess it should be about communicating with customers, but it's actually about talking to or speaking at customers And I think what you're highlighting is this idea or this opportunity to actually engage with customers. And I had this little quote that it came in this morning on just a spammed email from this guy at the Kellogg School of Management, which in Australia we'd think is, where'd you get your degree from? Kellogg's. But anyway, it's quite a legitimate school of management in the UK, in the US. But what Timothy Feddersen said, if you have people on your team who are particularly good at empathy, they are treasures right now. Listen to them. I thought that was so insightful, so interesting that at the moment when everything's changed, as we talked about before, Qantas totally transformed. That business has been disrupted profoundly.
Yes.
So trying to find, this whole series is about the decade of disruption. How do you thrive through that? And you talked offline around how maybe people aren't thinking about innovation and about growth and about opportunities. They're just trying to survive and trying to work out how the hell do we get through this? And you said maybe they're not thinking about me helping them with innovation. You're getting a lot more inquiries about what would people do? How do I understand the impact of this? Can you talk to us about how you think this disruptive event is going to maybe accelerate the focus on getting understanding of customers?
Yes, I actually think so there's two parts of this that are going through my head. The first is around as I said before, a lot more people have to work digitally, a lot more people are working virtually, and changing the way that they interact with businesses. Even when it comes to travel, how does Qantas help people achieve their aspiration of travel when they literally cannot fly overseas? That there are restrictions on that business. So they have to really get creative about, well, what is it that people are aspiring to when it comes to travel? How else do they support them through their business model? So I think the understanding of what people are going through at the moment is the big question that you kind of get. How has this affected the way people do things? Are people, so obviously there are people who have lost their jobs through this. They're incredibly vulnerable at the moment. What does it mean to offer products or services for vulnerable customers who actually may have worked for Qantas, and then suddenly they are furloughed because there's literally no work to do. They're not flying as many planes. So they're really challenging circumstances. I think the other part to it, though, is how do you go about understanding customers? Because ethnography normally would involve me going out and being in people's homes, but obviously that's been disrupted as well. We can't do that in the same way. And so we've just had to run a project for the last 6 weeks where we wanted to, do a traditional ethnographic review, and we had to change the way we worked. It's been disrupted. We had to do this digitally. We kind of went back to the diary study format and, getting people to fill in diaries, but actually doing that digitally. There are lots of also software tools out there to help people do the remote research as well to understand customers. I think what you said also, Cameron, around, there's lots of changes happening and people just trying to cope. But the way in which they're going about coping is essentially innovation. They just probably don't realize it. They're trying to understand really quickly, oh gosh, what's happening with customers? And where, they may have not picked up the phone before to talk to customers as much, or maybe customers are volunteering information as they're calling in. You're finding out rich sources of information and people are talking about that. I think then that what that does prompt is people to kind of say, well, how do we do this differently? And certainly I've seen that change internally, even the way that we work internally. So we have a staff of 13,000 people across Australia. They're all in different offices. And one Sunday night, we all got a text message to say, don't come into work tomorrow. You're all working from home. Now, to get to that sounds really, really easy because of COVID. Or, all right, we're all working from home. But for our tech teams, that was actually a really, really big challenge, because now you have a workforce of 13,000 people who are all going to log on at the same time in the morning, who are going to be using virtual meeting systems and everything else. You need to make sure you've got licenses and bandwidth and everything else to help make work effective. So I think that change also was, how do we be innovative in the way that we work? How do we be innovative in the way that we serve customers? And that is just kind of a daily conversation now. And we're probably not really using the word innovation for it. We're just getting on with it. When the Philippines closed, the essentially sent workers home as well, well, that had an effect on us because we have some people who work in the Philippines. So it means actually that when it comes to our tech and help support desks, they're not really there anymore. So gosh, what do we do? How do we help alleviate this situation? So certainly it spurred a whole heap of ideation in the company and understanding then, well, people are suddenly starting to do this. We're noticing this over here. How do we address that? What do we do? Let's spin up an idea and see how we can roll that out. I think that's the sort of things that are happening at the moment. I would say though that just getting back to the quote that you mentioned with humanities, I think this is the critical part. And there was a conversation, I hope my team members don't mind me saying this, but we use chat internally, and I have a data scientist on my team and a researcher on my team. And they were debating the problem to be solved for a project that we've got on. But I was in a meeting and I'm seeing this virtual chat pop up. And it was actually a really good example of the complementary skills that you need to solve things. You know, the data scientist in the way that they're thinking about the problem, and the researcher who has a background in psychology, really trying to understand the human and how they're bringing that together. I think getting that magic at the moment is really, really important for how you thrive essentially in this time of disruption.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I'm just going to share a screen just for the listeners, just as a promotional message from the sponsor, which is my employer, UQ. So what I love about this series is just getting different people's perspectives on innovation and on disruption. And so the next three series, I've got Mike Millenari. So Mike's the managing director of IP Group. So IP Group is a UK company that has a relationship with the main universities in Australia and in New Zealand, and they're investing in transformational technology. So that's going to be a great conversation. Terry Woodcroft is a lady that I've known for a long time. She's the founder of a new engineering technology that's spun out of universities, and really it's around how do you improve the life of transformers and other electrical assets. And then Paul Cerny is a great friend of mine, who's one of the founders of Tritium, which is actually driving the electric charging of vehicles. So that's going to be interesting because obviously that's a huge behavioural shift. But what Tritium's done a great job of, and what I think we're going to enjoy listening to Paul on, is how is the electric charging industry trying to mimic the petrol industry. You know, so you actually get charging stations where you can go and get a McDonald's or something while you're actually charging. And the other thing which I want to draw to people's attentions is the UQ MBA. We've had more interest in our MBA than we've ever had before. Applications close on the 30th of June. We're just getting a lot of interest there where people are actually thinking, everything I've known is changing and there's new opportunities. My job's either gone or I can see opportunities opening. And so just encourage anyone who's interested in that to think about that. The other thing, and we've had a couple of questions, but one of which I wanted to talk to is Nick Beaumast, who's asked. He's an ethnographic design researcher, and he's saying, well, how do you get a company to actually think that this is important? How do you actually get an organization to actually recognize that this is really that ethnography and anthropology, and to hire someone like you? I'm not sure whether there was a history of Suncorp having ethnographers and anthropologists, or how are you seeing this, and do you think this is going to accelerate? And how could either an ethnographer pitch themselves to a company, or how are you thinking that a company could actually look at getting hold of some of these skills?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I was overseas and making a choice of whether or not to come back to Australia because essentially ethnography in corporate practice in Australia is rather limited compared to what it is overseas. But in the time since I've come home, which is now like 4 years ago, it's grown a lot. if you think about any company, so every year I go to a conference, which is called the Ethnographic Practice in Industry Conference. This year it's actually being hosted out of Australia, which is fantastic. And when you turn up there, everyone works in a corporate environment. Any major technology company in the US or in Europe has an army of ethnographers. And I remember seeing the change, I think it was between, say, 2016 maybe and 2018. Facebook probably sent a couple of people, originally, and then suddenly there was like 50 people from Facebook coming along, which shows how much it has changed in that environment. And it really has been this intersection of understanding people and translating that into design. I arrived at Suncorp because they were hunting for someone who actually understood different types of research methods, including ethnography, to come and work in innovation specifically. There are other companies who look for this all the time in Australia. I think it's the way the language is used is a little bit different. If there's one way though that I would convince people why this is really important, is because I help them make better investment decisions. And for a corporate, that is a really, really big thing. So as I showed with the example before, I stopped us essentially investing millions of dollars into something that wasn't going to work. That's a massive decision that came from a place of ethnography. I would say then also when it comes to design and trying to be strategic about where do you go into the future, understanding how people's habits and rituals are changing as a result of perhaps technology or environmental factors is really, really important for decision making. And that's why it is such part and parcel of companies in the US. I mean, Melissa Sefkin that I think of at Nissan, who's designing automated vehicles for them. I think of Julia Haynes at Google, runs their design team. She's an anthropologist. There are lots of people who have these very interesting jobs around the world in companies that are involved very much in strategic decisions about design and innovation and where we can go in the future. I think really though, if you're trying to sell your skills, it's that you can understand people better than what the information is that they have right now. And that's a really, really good thing when you're trying to understand who your customer base is, who you're trying to design for, and essentially if it's a for-profit organization, how to make money.
Yeah. And that ultimately is understanding their problem to solve, which is, how to avoid being disrupted by other entities and other business models.
Exactly.
And expand their business. I mean, and that is clearly, everyone is very interested in that at the moment, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's constant discussion about, particularly in financial services, of disruption in financial services. I actually now think that disruption is just everywhere. Let's just accept it. And this is the space that we operate in. Having people who have studied humanities, I think, is really, really important to have in your business, which is also why it was a shame to see the recent policy decision by government around humanities degrees, because I don't think there was an understanding. They didn't practice ethnography. I don't think there was an understanding about how humanities really aligns with STEM disciplines to help accelerate, innovation work that is done. So, yeah.
That's great. And look, I totally agree. I think one thing you said, which is the magic happens at this intersection between human understanding and sort of it's the hacker, the hipster, and the hustler. It's the person who understands people, person who understands the tech, and people who understand the business. And I think modern businesses that are going to be successful and the FANGs of the world, have really got that. They've really understood how to get new business models embedded into people's behaviour. And I think I absolutely agree. And we've actually got a new project which we're just launching in July, which is a program with the Department of Defence called the Defence Innovation Bridge, where we're looking at how can an organisation like Defence, which is a really big, really conservative organisation, and they're faced with this issue around artificial intelligence. And all the bad guys have got lots of artificial intelligence. The stuff that we have, is not sovereign. It's come from the US or it's come from overseas. And so they're looking, well, how do we accelerate our ability to develop this capability? And so we've developed this program that I'm actually going to be using some of our MBA students next semester to help us spend some time understanding. But what we're going to do is build a program where we've got some social scientists from the School of Humanities who are sort of arts literature sort of people who are actually really good at creating scenarios and creating stories. And then the engineers and the scientists, and then the actual soldiers themselves. So actually getting people who are actually in the actual defense industry, whether they're in front of a computer or out on the field, and actually trying to discover what are the what ifs that we could do. But actually I think it's so important to have that human side and the technical side merged together. And with AI and machine learning, we can actually do that at scale. And that's what I think is really exciting.
Yeah, AI in particular, you need humanities. I mean, Genevieve Bell is just the work that she does in AI. She's an anthropologist. There's a reason why that is the way it is. You need to understand people, I think, to help build an artificial intelligence. So yeah, it's a really important combination of skills. And what you described, Cameron, is exactly participatory innovation, that you are combining together lots of different skills together with actual soldiers and defense employees. That's exactly participatory innovation.
Excellent. Great. Well, I've learned so much off of you, Shae. So thanks so much for your generosity in sharing with us today. I'm hoping to get you back and speak to some of our MBA classes, because your session you did last year was great.
Yeah, thanks.
And look, I think it's amazing, and I'm hoping that we see more and more of this, ethnography, anthropology, and this just the human-centered design, but actually not just saying it, but actually doing it. Rather than actually just paying lip service, because we do lots of surveys. Or I think that deep understanding of humans is what is going to unlock the next lot of disruptions, the next lot of innovations. And so I really appreciate your time coming along. But for those of you that are watching, I've just got a short poll which Lee's going to put up. But Shae, thanks so much for coming along, and this will be available online so people can share it. But look forward to catching up when we can all actually sit across the table and have a coffee.
Yeah, exactly. We'll just elbow bump in the meantime, Cameron.
Yeah, all right. Thanks so much, Shae. It's been great chatting.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you again soon.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.